Well, good morning. Welcome to the online Sunday school lesson of Malden First Baptist Church in Malden, South Carolina. I'm Barry Ray, glad to be with you this morning as we continue our study in the book of 1 Kings. So if you have your Bible with you, go ahead and start turning for 1 Kings in the Old Testament. We're going to be in chapter 12 again this week. And today we continue our study in the Old Testament book of 1 Kings. We certainly began on a high note when we started this study with regard to the kingdom of Israel. Solomon had just become king, and when God told him to ask for anything he wanted and that he would be granted it, remember he asked for wisdom. He could have asked for money, a long reign, the death of his enemies, or just about anything else, but God was so pleased with his heart and intent that he gave him wisdom and all of the other elements of success needed for an historic reign. Indeed, Solomon is still synonymous with wisdom today. Solomon built the temple his father David was not allowed to build. He ruled wisely and expanded the kingdom into the most powerful in that part of the world. But, as we learned last week, he did not end well. His insatiable desire for hundreds of foreign wives led him down a path of disobedience, sin, and pride. God noted that Solomon had violated the covenant between them, that he would lead as long as he would be faithful to God's laws. His kingdom was taken away. Today, in looking at the story of his son, King Rehoboam, we see the beginning of the end for the United Nation of Israel. The question in all tragedies is why? Today we learn the answer. This king has an opportunity to rebuild and strengthen unity in the nation. Failure to do so would result in a split and decline. It's one of the most critical times in Israel's history. Have you ever spent time in an organization with a really bad leader? If you live long enough, it is likely to happen at least once. Bad decision after bad decision leads to an unhealthy environment and atmosphere. Disheartened employees, hostile work environment. In most of these circumstances, however, there always seem to be a pocket of people who seem to get every promotion. They are the only people the leader seems to listen to. We know them as yes men or women. Sensing insecurity, weakness, and ego in the leader, they curry favor by agreeing with every notion he or she has, no matter how unwise it seems. You know, one of my favorite folk tales when I was a kid was the story of the emperor's new clothes. You're likely familiar with the story. Most of you probably remember it. Some con artists come into the kingdom and promise to make regal clothes that will surpass those of any king. However, the clothing would be invisible to people of lesser intelligence. He visited their empty looms, and for fear of being considered stupid, he kept praising the clothes and eventually paraded around his kingdom in his skivvies, believing he was wearing regal robes. It is a hilarious story, but it's also, like most stories, it has a tremendous moral. None of his advisors would tell him the truth for fear of losing their position with him, so they, along with the uncomfortable townspeople, went along with the whole charade, and it was an embarrassing display. Finally, a child shouts out from the crowd, "The emperor has no clothes." It's something that my wife has probably heard me say 1,000 times during our long marriage because it's a phrase that's always stuck with me. That's what becomes of a leader who surrounds himself with yes men. It's what happens to King Rehoboam in our lesson today. After assuming the throne, he visits the northern territory where his brother Jeroboam had fled from Solomon. I know the names get confusing in this story, but I will try to be clear. Jeroboam had become the leader of a group of people who were hoping to be relieved of some of the burdensome taxes and other oppression like forced labor, that they endured under Solomon, as he had a massive building program. They asked Rehoboam to relieve some of the burden, and that's where we join the story today. Experience speaks. We're in 1 Kings chapter 12, and we will read verses 6 and 7. Then King Rehoboam consulted with the elders who had served his father Solomon when he was alive, asking, "How do you advise me to respond to this people?" They replied, "Today, if you will be a servant to this people and serve them, and if you respond to them by speaking kind words to them, they will be your servants forever." You know, wise counsel is available to anyone who's willing to seek it and listen. The same advisors who had assisted Solomon in building the greatest kingdom in that part of the world were willing to share their experience with Rehoboam. They wisely told him to go easy on this group of people. They asked him to use kind, unifying words and show them that he would be a servant leader. By doing so, he would make them loyal, and the entire nation of Israel would be as unified as it was under King David. Servant leadership. It's a very important topic in our world today. We see all kinds of leaders, but most of us as Christians really believe in servant leadership. There's a great book written about servant leadership. It's called Lead Like Jesus. One of our local universities has a master's program where they teach executives this book as part of their curriculum. Servant Leadership, Lead Like Jesus. Here's a quote from the book by Kenneth Blanchard. "When people know the leader cares about them and wants to help them grow, a new culture of trust and community develops, resulting in both high performance and great human satisfaction." Now that sounds like an organization I'd like to work for. Wise leaders know how to seek out wise counsel. And certainly this king showed some wisdom in calling together this group of advisors, and they were faithful to give it to him. However, seeking out wise advice is just the first step. Most of us have had at least one time in our lives where we received good advice about an important decision and later ignored it. Later, with the benefit of hindsight, we realize that we suffered because we didn't follow it. Our parents wanted to save us from suffering, but we may have gone our own way and paid for it. That's what happens to this king. Let's look at 1 Kings chapter 12, and I'll read verses 8 through 11 as we find that rather than humility or servant leadership, this king Rehoboam displays arrogance. But he rejected the advice of the elders who had advised him and consulted with the young men who had grown up with him and attended him. He asked them, "What message do you advise that we send back to this people who said to me, 'Lighten the yoke your father put on us'?" The young men who had grown up with him told him, "This is what you should say to this people who said to you, 'Your father made our yoke heavy, but you make it lighter on us.' This is what you should tell them. 'My little finger is thicker than my father's waist. Although my father burdens you with a heavy yoke, I will add to your yoke. My father disciplined you with whips, but I will discipline you with barbed whips.'" Enter the yes men. The scripture refers to this second group as the people the king had grown up with. Literally translated, they were people who became great with him. In other words, these were people who gathered around Rehoboam as he was seeking to solidify support to gain the throne. Rather than consider the greater good, these younger men were drunk with their newfound power. They had power, but no empathy. They had power, but lacked the experience to use it wisely for the greater good. I'm sure examples of people like that are popping into each and every one of your minds at this point. The king had two very different pieces of advice to consider, and making the wrong choice would mean disaster. Unfortunately, the yes men appealed to the king's ego. Ego is the enemy of any leader. It's ever present, and unless we keep it in check, it can lead to destruction, both our own personal destruction and the destruction of whatever organization we may be leading. History is littered with famous examples of this, and as I said, you're likely thinking of some right now. We're going to read verses 12 through 15 now. So Jeroboam and all the people came to Rehoboam on the third day, as the king had ordered. Return to me on the third day. Then the king answered the people harshly. He rejected the advice the elders had given him and spoke to them according to the young men's advice. My father made your yoke heavy, but I will add to your yoke. My father disciplined you with whips, but I will discipline you with barbed whips. The king did not listen to the people, because this turn of events came from the Lord to carry out his word, which the Lord had spoken through Ahijah the Shilonite to Jeroboam, son of Nebat. Not only did Rehoboam follow the advice of his friends, but he did so to the letter. He unleashed a disastrous pronouncement that not only depressed those who heard it, but it unleashed a prophecy. See, one can misinterpret the last portion of this section. It may look as though God made Rehoboam say the harsh things to the people of northern Israel, but that's really not the case. God had spoken to Jeroboam through a prophet, Ahijah the Shilonite. In that prophecy, the Lord said that he had chosen Jeroboam to rule Israel after he tore much of the kingdom away from Rehoboam. God used his arrogance to fulfill a promise he made to Jeroboam through the prophet. So, in other words, the prophecy assumed that Rehoboam would do the wrong thing. That's the way prophecy works. But it's not an instance where God caused Rehoboam to do the wrong thing. Unfortunately, he expected him to. Let's look at verses 16 through 19. So when all Israel saw that the king had not listened to them, the people answered him, "What portion do we have in David? We have no inheritance in the son of Jesse. Israel, return to your tents. David, now look after your own house." So Israel went to their tents, but Rehoboam reigned over the Israelites living in the cities of Judah. Then King Rehoboam sent Adoram, who was in charge of forced labor. But all Israel stoned him to death. King Rehoboam managed to get into the chariot and flee to Jerusalem. Israel is still in rebellion against the house of David today. What powerful prophetic words. When the angry people responded, "What portion do we have in David?" they meant the kingdom God had given David and then Solomon had left them behind. They had all had an equal stake in a unified kingdom, but as God promised Solomon, the kingdom left for the house of David would survive, but be much smaller. God had promised Solomon that he would tear the kingdom from him, but allow a part of it to remain for the sake of David. Remember, despite his failings, David ultimately kept his promise to remain faithful to the Lord, and he, unlike Solomon, finished well. Rehoboam now ruled over the Israelites living in the cities of Judah. Jeroboam would rule over the rest of Israel. This is what the once unified nation now looked like. Rehoboam made a last-ditch attempt to smooth things over and prevent the split. But in another extraordinarily bad move, he sent one of his father's officials, but the wrong one. He sent the one who forced them into harsh labor to accomplish Solomon's aggressive building projects. So they stoned him to death. Rehoboam managed to escape in a chariot, but the damage was done. Israel was now divided into two kingdoms. the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah. Ultimately, Israel fell to Assyria in 722 and 721 BC, and Judah fell to Babylon in 586 BC. Sadly, Jeroboam did not follow the part of the prophecy that required him to lead with faithfulness to God. Therefore, his kingdom fell as well. He spent his whole reign trying to make sure two halves of Israel stayed apart, and the house divided fell entirely. People who have been to the Holy Land any time within the last 20 or 30 years can tell you that that enmity between the northern and southern kingdoms still exists. When you go to certain holy sites in the Holy Land, my mother was just sharing this with me before I came over here to teach this today. They were warned in their tour bus as they went to one of the holy sites that people will throw rocks at your bus and they will hurl insults at you. It's still that same division between the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom, although we call them by different names today. You know, all stories like this have a moral, just as the folktale we talked about at the beginning of the lesson today. What is the moral of this sad tale? Well, making self-deserving decisions always leads to failure. In addition to our success or failure can often be determined by whose voices we listen to. Do we seek out wise counsel and follow it? Or do we keep looking for those who make us feel good? We'll do well to try the former. Thank you so much for being with us this morning. Hope you enjoy the rest of the day and our service just a few minutes from now, and have a great week.
So if you have a need or a concern or want to discuss your relationship with Jesus, please feel free to call us at 864-288-7835 or contact us on the website at maldenfirstbaptist.org.
This has been a video presentation of Malden First Baptist Church, Malden, South Carolina.